I guess. Life's Ukrainian. I believe all. We're in charge of it tonight. О, доброе утро. Ну, все нормально, да.
Check. Good morning, everybody. We're going to start in a few minutes, but before we did so, I just wanted to make sure everybody was, because this is about making connections, we want to make sure everybody's connected to the IRI network. If you want to connect to the wireless network here, it's IRI guest. The password is welcome to IRI, capital W, capital T, and capitals IRI. So IRI guest, and password is welcome to IRI. Thank you very much. We're going to start in a few minutes.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you here again for the second day of the Transatlantic Conference. We're delighted that all of you can join us. Again, as always, I want to thank our partners in this conference, Martens Centre, the Hudson Institute, the European Ideas Network. We think it's a great collaboration. I hope you are pleased as well. You may have noticed, some of you, when you came in this morning, that we have here in our doors a quote from our former vice chairman of the board, Rich Williamson. And Rich once said, "You have to be a realist to take steps day by day, but you have to be an idealist to know where you are going." And I think that in very many ways is the theme for this conference, because we all recognize that there are complex challenges facing us in many parts of the world. Challenges that will require patient persistence, cheerful persistence, but we also have to remember those ideas, those themes, that spirit that guides all of us. And here in this room, we represent the center right. We represent certain fundamental beliefs in the power of markets, in the power of human liberty, of allowing people to shape and craft their own future. These are the ideas that guide us and show us the long path that we must take. But in our discussions today, we talk about what we need to do day to day through patient persistence to get there. So again, I want to thank all of you. I hope you are enjoying this conference. I have seen that you have a full agenda today, and some place called Russia apparently is going to be a topic for discussion. I'm sure none of you have ever heard of it or anything like that. But again, welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Paulo, I turn the podium over to you. But I'll take my coffee back.
Okay. So good morning for you all. I'd like to apologize for this delay, but as you know, a part of us, we are returning this early afternoon, and so there were a lot of stuff to prepare before coming here. And in my particular case, we have tomorrow at lunch in Lisbon, the annual lunch with the President of the Republic. And as I'm the head of our delegation, there were some logistics to prepare, and to have these contacts, I had these phone calls to do before this event. The only thing that I would like to say, even before our session, is thank you to the Republican Institute, to the Hudson Institute, to Martens Centre, on behalf of European Ideas Network. These 2 or 3 days were really fantastic. We have a very, very substantial discussion. We could exchange views. We could see that we have different perspectives, but that we do share the same values. And this is really important to build this relationship between the 2 sides of the Atlantic. The only thing that I would add to my fellow friends of the United States of America is that for us, now Europeans, your support, your focus, your attention on the European problems, and especially in the European borders, the eastern border with Russia, the southern border with the Mediterranean, and even, I would say, the southeastern border with Islamic State, are really in such a dangerous situation that we need your full attention for these problems. I know that the United States are, I would say, used to be focused in a global perspective, and that is needed. We know that there are problems in the China Sea, that are problems with Iran that are not disconnected from this Islamic State issue and from the Middle East question, of course. But it's very important to focus on this decisive moment. I think that we are going to have a hot summer. And during this hot summer, we will need your help. So please count on us, because we are counting on you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, for those remarks. Thank you very much. And welcome, everyone, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of IRI, Hudson Institute. Welcome to day 2 of our conference. Yesterday, we had great discussions on a number of topics. We talked about trade, we talked about commerce, we talked about elections, we talked about security. Today, we're going to talk about something that's at the crossroads of all those subjects and more, and that is Russia and the conflict that we face in dealing with Russia and with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Russia under Putin has changed the post-World War II understanding of borders in Europe. Russia under Putin has altered our understanding in terms of intervention. Russia, on the record, has maintained that it has the right to intervene to protect the rights of Russian speakers anywhere. Not Russian citizens, Russian speakers. All one has to do is look at a map to see there are substantial numbers of Russian speakers in all parts of the world, not just in the former Soviet republics, not just in the Warsaw Pact countries. And I'll note that of the former republics, there are 3 countries that are members of NATO, where there are significant Russian speakers. Russia continues to deny that it has troops and equipment in eastern Ukraine, something that was refuted completely by Boris Nemtsov's recent report. I hope you've had the chance to read it. If you don't, come to us. We'll make sure that you get a copy. It's called Vojna Putina, Putin's War. It goes into great detail to describe what Russian units have been sent and have served in eastern Ukraine. Totally refutes the Kremlin line that it has no troops in Ukraine. Russia has many weapons at its disposal. It has energy. It has its military. It has trade in the form of agricultural and other embargoes. And it has media. If you want to qualify it as media, we describe it as propaganda. With all these weapons at its disposal and its willingness to intervene, Russia presents an existential threat to the West. So today, you're going to have the opportunity to hear from a truly representative transatlantic panel of distinguished experts on Russia. I'll introduce them briefly. Our plan today is to hear from each of our speakers, and then we're going to have plenty of time for discussion because I think we'll have a lot of questions and a lot of commentary. I'll start first with the gentleman to my right, Mikolash Zorinda, great friend, longtime friend of IRI. The great thing about Mikolash, I like to say, is that the very few people have made the transition from political party leader to statesman. It's a rare breed, but Mikolash is one who's done that. He established the Christian Union Democratic Party of Slovakia and then led his country as prime minister. So he's one of the few that have really bridged that gap between politician and statesman. So it's great to have you here today with us, Mikolash. Similarly, we're very fortunate to have Sandra Kalniate, who joins us, not only a member of parliament, but has served her country as ambassador to France, ambassador to the United Nations, and as a citizen of Latvia. She's on the front lines of this confrontation with Russia and Putin. So we look forward to what you have to say today, Sandra. Next, we have Jeff Gedman. Jeff, as you all know, did a tremendous job leading Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in a very difficult time. And he was one of the proponents, we feel, of promoting democracy and human rights in Europe and Eurasia. So again, Jeff, we welcome you here, and we're very, very excited to have you here with us today and hear from you. Finally, we have David Kramer. David served this country, our country, with distinction in two roles. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, and he also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights and Labor at our State Department. In those two capacities, Dave dealt up front with the Russian leadership. He has confronted the Lavrovs and the others, and he is one of the most outspoken advocates of what I think policy should be on Russia here in Washington. So again, it's a great honor to have you here with us today, David. So we're going to go right into the presentations. We'll go through the presentations. After that, we'll take your questions. Mikolash, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Stephen. You have described the recent behavior of the Kremlin and Vladimir Vladimirovich very rightly and correctly. So now a legitimate question is, what is the diagnosis of such a behavior in the recent times? I mean that the main feature of this diagnosis is a fear. A fear of weakening or losing power, which is very typical for every authoritarian regime. And this is the basis of all activities coming in recent times from the Kremlin. It is maybe not easy to understand such a behavior because the main feature of our civilization, of our world, which is a world of liberal democracy or multi-party democracy, is our ability and will to share power in case of winning elections. We are sharing power with the opposition, with civic society, with independent media, and many other fragments or segments of our societies. And of course, in case of losing elections, we are able and we are willing, maybe not willing, but we are ready to pass the power, to hand over the power. But for the regime in Moscow, for the regime of Vladimir Putin, such a behavior is unacceptable, impossible, because condizione sine qua non is only to prolong, to keep, to stick to the power and to prolong power as long as possible for all costs. So this is why conflict with Russia is really serious and really fundamental one. For Putin, by my conviction, the main enemy is not the West, neither United States nor Ukraine. The main enemy for Putin is our values, especially the value of multi-party democracy. And especially after Maidan, when Yanukovych skipped off the country, recognizing that the anger of people is very high, very big, and very dangerous. I can imagine emotions of Vladimir Putin in these days, or during the night when they decided to annex Crimea. So this is the reason why Putin needs to demonstrate that Russia is strong and the West is the weak. That Russia is able to defend traditions and the West is decadent. This is why Putin needs to destabilize the West and the countries willing to belong to our world. And this is why Russia will do everything in its power to prevent success story of Ukraine and its integration ambitions. And this is also why Putin is trying to divide the West by nurturing some political parties from our camp in the European Union. Parties of the far left, but also some parties from the far right, as Tono Lopez demonstrated yesterday. And this is why Russia promotes disinformation and propaganda in a very, very sophisticated mode. So this was a short description of the main diagnosis which is behind the recent behavior of Russian elite and especially of Vladimir Putin. Now, a very logical and legitimate question is, what can we do, or what should the West do in these difficult times to succeed? I will deliver very briefly some measures in 4 areas. The first, I believe that we have to invalidate the basic paradigm by which Russia is guided in these days. I am pretty sure that Vladimir Putin and his regime is convinced that neither NATO nor the EU can integrate a country which is unable to exercise jurisdiction over all of its territory. This is why Russia severed Abkhazia and Ossetia from Georgia. This is why Russia doesn't want to withdraw from Transnistria. This is why Russia has been annexed Crimea and is disturbing every day Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast area. In other words, I am pretty sure that Russia is convinced that as long as Ukraine is not stable and consolidated, they can enter neither the EU nor NATO. And of course, I am sure that this paradigm must be invalidated. Legitimate question is, of course, a very logical how. I offer two measures. The first is to step up the sanctions while declaring that these sanctions will be applied as long as Ukraine doesn't acquire control over its borders with Russia. And the second measure is to public or to state publicly that as far or as long as Ukraine is able to meet criteria in both political and economic, the door for NATO and door for the EU is open. The second area in which we should operate is that I believe we should eliminate two major weapons which are in the hands of Vladimir Putin. The first is propaganda, and the second is energy dependence. Speaking about propaganda, we could spend many hours to deliver some suggestions or proposals, but I believe that this is a space which is huge for our operations, for operations of non-governmental organizations, such as IRI, Martens Centre, or our Slovak NGOs. By the way, my own Slovak NGOs is doing this. Yesterday, I heard that Stefan Gerold with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is organizing a speaking tour across Germany to promote TTIP advantages. I do the same dealing with Ukraine and Russia in Slovakia. I am meeting with my friends, universities, gymnasiums, but also we organize evening events with the public. Last time we had in Bratislava maybe 200 people, and very lively 3 hours long debate to speak about these questions. And energy dependence. I believe that in this area we can do a lot in cooperation with the United States, but also in a broader space. José María Aznar, the former Spanish Prime Minister, has established together with Hopkins University here in the United States a very special visionary cooperation or project named Transatlantic Basin Initiative. Cooperation in the space between North and South America, Europe and Asia, and energy is one of very substantial areas in which we can do something to be less dependent on Russia as we are in these days. Area number 3, I believe that we should and we could promote reforms in the countries of Eastern Partnership, also in the countries of the Balkans. And again, this is an area in which our Martens Centre for European Studies is very active. Since December of last year, we are sending every month one leader from the country passing through reforms in the past. Balcerowicz from Poland, Jan Krzysztof Bielecki from Poland, Miklos from Slovakia, Janez Janša from Slovenia, Juhan Pars from Estonia. We are spending 3 days with many activities, a lot of publicity, lectures at the universities, and the echo of this project is very strong, and we will continue in doing this. And last but not least, I believe that we should promote as broadly as possible the captivating narrative of the countries of Eastern and Central Europe passing through reforms, joining NATO, joining the European Union. And this is substantial. A personal experience usually is the best one, and I will finish with sharing this, my personal experience. Only less than 1 mile, there is a special building in Washington, the White House. And I remember my first talks with President Clinton, March 1999. Slovakia was excluded from integration, isolated. Madeleine Albright labeled Slovakia as a black hole of Europe because of my predecessor. I don't want to pronounce his name, but it was a very difficult time for Slovakia. Can you imagine? I took the power in time when Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary enlarged NATO. So I came to the White House in March 1999, 3 months after being appointed as the Prime Minister, telling at the end of our discussion to President Clinton, "Sir, I want to have my country into NATO. He started to keep smiling. You missed the opportunity, sir, he told me. You missed the opportunity. And now we are looking for a new configuration, such as Czech Republic, Poland, or Hungary. I said, Mr. President, I know such a configuration. Really, tell me. I said, double S. What does it mean? Slovakia, Slovenia. Ha, 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 ha. Slovakia, Slovenia. Not enough. Maybe if Romania or Bulgaria is interested, it would be different. So, listening this, I blurted out, and what about the Baltic states, Mr. President? And then the sentence will emerge. President Clinton told me, Russia will allow it never. Ladies and gentlemen, March 1999. In 5 years, 7 countries, including double S, including Bulgaria, Slovakia, including Baltic states, enlarged NATO. So this is a case which should be spread, and by which such countries like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, but also Montenegro, and I am sorry, maybe I am too courageous one day, maybe Serbia, should be encouraged. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Mikola. Thank you for setting the stage with your remarks. Thank you very much for those insights. And I'm sure there'll be a number of questions. We will now turn to you, Sandra. And as I understand, you have PowerPoint presentation?
Yes. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to begin with saying that after Mikolas Dzurinda, it's very difficult to say something different, which confirms that his vision is most based on reality, because I'm going to tell almost the same, maybe differently structured, which confirms another thing, that we, countries who were formerly dominated by the Soviet Union, as Slovakia or Baltic states which were part of Soviet Union, we have very close and deep understanding of Russia, which is in a vulgar language would be called gut feeling about it. And I regret until now that for years and years, this exceptional expertise, what the last enlargement countries have on Russia, was neglected, because we were put under suspicion that we are seeking a sort of revanche, that we can't be objective because we had a very biased relationship in the past with that country. If our expertise would be taken seriously when we warned that since Putin came to power, he is constructing a state which will present a danger to European Union and to the democratic world. However, we still can do something, and my first conviction is that we have more to concentrate on ourselves than on Russia. This is one of the mistakes, contemporary mistakes, that we are so taken by different studies. What exactly Russia wants, how Putin will proceed, is he well-balanced, does he have well-balanced personality, or there is some misbalance in his apprehension of world. What we have to do in the European Union, in democratic world, in United States, we have to concentrate on the ways how we are going to counter Putin's confrontational politics. In general, I would like to speak about the messages. And messages are of two ways. The one which is completely for domestic consumption in Russia, and then there is another one, much more diverging and confused, for the West. First, let's speak about main messages for domestic consumption. The first and the most powerful is West conspires against Russia. that there are plans to overthrow Putin and to dismember Russia. And this is something what nation believes, and what is also confirmed by the destiny of Soviet Union. And then what are the instruments? For instance, color revolutions we witnessed during last 10 years, and also civil war on Ukraine is a part of that plan, how to overthrow and dismember Russia. Russia has right to defend itself because Russia is under attack, and the idea that the great patriotic war, the Second World War, as it is called in Russia, continues. And this narrative is very present, particularly in this year when we celebrated the anniversary, round anniversary of the end of the Second World War. You know that Putin has 85, even growing approval rate among Russians. And in a way, he is completely equal with the idea of Russia. Defending Russia, we are defending also Putin, and defending Putin, we are defending Russia. And then there is a third narrative, which is rather strong and also inherited from Soviet Union. There was a legendary foreign minister, Gromyko, and he almost every year he put on the table a new initiative, Soviet initiative for peace. Russia also stands for peace. It's US and NATO who is for war. And if Russia is spending 20% of its budget for defense and cutting in all other budgetary positions because of economic difficulties they are going through, it's justified by preparation for defense. Russia don't want war. On the contrary, US and NATO, we are for aggression. I hope it will jump, yes. To put it in 2 lines, West is for war, Russia for peace. West wants chaos in Russia, Russia wants stability. West is decadent. Russia represents values, true values. West is aggressive. Russia stands for its right to defend itself. West is hypocritical. And just few examples of that hypocrisy. From the recent history, it's Libya or Kosovo. From the more ancient history, it's a Munich deal, which is language quite oftenly used in Russia. If West is hypocritical, so we are people talking straightly. We love straight talk. US is dominating the world. It's a hegemony. Russia, on contrary, wants a fair world order. The question is what Russia understands under the fair world order. That is multipolar world with a new division of spheres of influence. Agreement between new superpowers, how they divide the world. The question stays for countries like Latvia, who never will be taken into account of such new world order, where we stay, where it leaves us. Almost certain that Russia sees that's in a buffer zone. If we speak about messages to West, that then there you will not find a single narrative, because all possibilities are used very skillful to confuse, disorganize, misinform, to deceive. And instruments of this are very modern, like channels Russia Today and Sputnik, broadcasting in several languages, and one of their ideas, which is put very shortly, question more, is to undermine the confidence in the media, the confidence in the democracy, and also in EU and NATO in general in the West, with the discussions which put everything in a gray shadow and question. Russia is building upon anti-Americanism, which is present in the world, which is present also in EU countries. And sometimes I'm asking, what good Russia had done to Europeans that so many are Russophiles? And what bad United States have done to Europe that so many Europeans feel anti-American? I don't understand it, especially after the First and Second World War and the reconstruction which was possible in the West with American Marshall Plan. There also, of course, we are 28 countries in the European Union, and there are different interests. We accept that we are together for our general interest, but when it comes to particular solutions, there are tensions and there are divisions. You know, it is a success that we were able to introduce sanctions against Russia, which was a great surprise for Putin, I presume. He was not expecting something like that. He was relying to his most friendly countries like Greece, Italy, and others to veto that decision. We have also divisions not only among countries, but also in our institutions sometimes, and alliances. But the most important is that we have very highly developed compromise culture, which helps us to have to a decision and to a solution. Russia stands for confrontation. That is its official position now. However, I don't think that Russia is ready for that confrontation. In reality, what Russia wants, it's a new deal with the West. And there are several diplomatic efforts under the table, not on the table. They are explored if there could be find a solution. I think you see. Oh no, it's bigger as a screen. Then you can read also how we can counter Russia's messages. There are many different ways, and I think the most important is that we stay united in front of that challenge. And then I say united, I do not mean only European Union, I mean our transatlantic unity, what we have and what we have to reinforce. And I'm very happy that External Service of European Union is now dividing much more time how to strengthen cooperation with NATO, which is also a very mighty instrument how to counter Russia. We have to put our money, as the saying goes, where our mouth is, which means that we have to give adequate and efficient investment in peace. I underline in peace, which means 2% of GDP for strengthening our defense. For many European countries, it still will take a time, but there is growing understanding of absolute necessity. You just can't decide tonight and tomorrow implement. It takes time. Then what I see as of utmost importance is Ukraine, how we stabilize Ukraine politically, economically, and also how we strengthen Ukraine's capacity to defend itself against Russia. When I'm thinking about 300 billion which were given to Greece and all the energy and efforts to resolve Greek crisis, I feel that Ukraine unjustly is pushed on the backside. After 100 years, when historians will try to grasp the achievements and the failures of our time. I think they will be very puzzled why Greece got 380 billion and Ukraine 40 billion. In the situation when the future of Europe does not lie in Greece, but it goes with Ukraine. And then being a Latvian, I'm very grateful for NATO strengthening its presence in Baltic states. And it has still to be strengthened. I'm grateful to United States for deployment in Baltic states. We will solve Greek crisis. This I hope we will do. Then what is also important to counter Russia, it's TTIP. There are many voices in US and also in Europe against this free trade agreement. However, it will create the biggest free trade area in the world. And I'm also pleading for transatlantic energy partnership. I was very happy to hear from Congress that this year, at the end of the year, they can lift the ban of export of energy resources. For Europe, for Europe's independence from Russian sources, it's very important. And then a few words about propaganda, because that is a very mighty instrument of brainwashing of Putin, and we have to focus on the most vulnerable, on Russian speakers. In Europe, they are very many in borderlands and in general. Recently, European Endowment for Democracy made a study
Yeah, no. You pitched as a Revolution of 1831.
Just modern European history, French diplomacy in the 19th century.
Okay,
That's
great.
good enough. Nobody remembers Louis Philippe.
Bradley's precise mission is to promote civil society, free markets, democratic capitalism.
Yeah,
That's
good.
okay. Well, good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute, and we are delighted to be co-hosting this wonderful Transatlantic Think Tank Conference with our good friends at IRI, our good friends from the Wilfried Martens Centre, and for the European Ideas Network. I think it's been an extraordinary morning. And before we move over to Hudson Institute this afternoon, which is just a couple of blocks away in the nice Washington heat, we're going to hear some reflections, informal reflections entitled Reflections on the
State of the world.
Reflections of the State of the World, Reflections of the U.S.-European Relations, Reflections on Europe from the American Midwest by Dan Schmidt. Dan Schmidt is the Vice President for Programs at the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. The Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation is the most prominent American conservative foundation, and its specific areas of interest are in promoting civil society, democratic capitalism, and individual liberty. They've played a very critical role in promoting school choice in the United States and promoting policies that opposed Soviet communism in the good old days, and in promoting welfare reform. And they've been good partners of Hudson Institute for some time. I should note that the chair of the CEO of the Bradley Foundation, Michael Grebe, served as the chair for Mark Green's run for governor of Wisconsin a number of years back. So they're also close ties to IRI. Now, Dan is a European historian by training. He has a role, I think, that's probably similar to a lot of American elites who are concerned about Europe and who focus on Europe. That at one point it was your big focus when both during your PhD years and as you taught at Marquette, and then as you went off and as the Cold War ended, it became less of a full-time focus as you expanded your portfolio in the philanthropic world. So Dan will bring some unique insights as someone who doesn't do this on a daily basis and who can see the forest from the trees or the dunes from the little grains of sand. And Dan, it's an absolute pleasure. We at Hudson have worked closely with Dan for a couple of decades. It's always a great pleasure and lots of fun to hear his insights on critical issues. So with no further ado, I turn it over to Dan.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ken. And of course, thanks to the Martens Centre and IRI for putting on this wonderful event. And, I asked Ken before whether my few remarks, in philanthropy, you get to make these wide remarks that sometimes don't apply to reality. So I said, well, will I be before lunch or after lunch or during lunch? It has to do with digestion and also people's hunger. So I think I'm sort of in the middle here. So I'm going to keep it brief because in these 2 days, at least day and a half that I've attended, pretty much sort of the U.S. and Europe and what's the relationship and where is it going and how hopeless is it or how incremental do we have to think and all the rest of it. So I don't want to repeat all that. I'll just refer to a couple of recent surveys that took place, which are kind of interesting in terms of public attitudes in the U.S. And of course, that includes the Midwest. To give you some context on, or put a few phrases down to what people have been saying on and off, including Elliot, for example, who said, people out there don't think Americans want to pay any price. And a few of these other remarks, Craig Kennedy yesterday, and then during the intelligence seminar, if you will, there were references to lack of trust and so forth. So all these things apply, and I won't repeat all these things, and you know them anyway, and they've affirmed them for you, and I guess with the survey I'll refer to with respect to elites and foreign policy in the U.S. and public attitudes toward issues in foreign policy that may reaffirm this for you, unfortunately. And then there was an interesting survey that came out also last June, as this first one I mentioned came out in June of this year, on millennials and sort of where they are in the U.S. on foreign policy issues. It's a real pleasure to be here because of Mark Green. Ken's already referred to Mark and his service to the citizens of Wisconsin when he served in the state assembly. I believe the years were the same as Scott Walker, who just announced for the presidency. I think they both served from 93 to 2006. And then, of course, Congressman Green became Congressman Green after being Assemblyman Green in the U.S. Congress and served with distinction there, and then on to Tanzania. So really, he should be up here talking to you about the Middle West and foreign policy and international issues. But Bradley, as Ken so generously said, and I think in our last panel, we had one panelist reference the distinguished people on the panel and in the audience. So I have the same situation, facing some people here that know a lot more about what we do at Bradley with respect to the issues you've been talking about, including the last panel on Africa. But Ken told you a little bit about Bradley. It's in the middle western part of the United States. It's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is about an hour and a half drive north of Chicago, if you're familiar with Chicago. And briefly, its history is really a European, as you'd expect, the 19th century German history, really. The city was founded in 1848, and we had some Frankfurt Parliament people who came to the city, as they did to St. Louis and other parts in the Midwest. So Milwaukee fits into the pattern of Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and so forth. We have a long tradition of German language papers and German arts and culture. Controversy in 1914 through 1917, and fundraisers for German citizens who were engaged in combat in an event that we just commemorated, 1914. We had a sort of very dramatic visit from Konrad Adenauer in 1956, who came to thank the citizens of Milwaukee, one, really, most principally for their support of not just Germans, but Europeans in general, and the sort of in the aftermath of World War II. It was very dramatic. He received an honorary degree at Marquette University and then gave a very dramatic speech. There were some protests, as you might expect in those days, and I think we still had some German language dailies at that time. The reason I mention this is that some of this has drifted away, as you'd expect. Immigration patterns have changed much more dramatically than they did at the beginning of the 20th century, when we had Slovaks and Poles and East Europeans. Now it's a Latin, Mexican immigration, and some Asian, although the Middle West probably has less of a concentration on Asian demographic change than the coasts and so forth, other parts of the country. But there is, I think, at base, even though the teaching of history in schools has slipped quite a bit in our country and perhaps in yours as well, especially the elementary level, gymnasium level. But there's a basic understanding, I think, in the DNA of people in Milwaukee of the contributions of not just Germany, but really the Western tradition with respect to the formation of our city and state. Let me quick jump ahead to sort of these surveys. And I won't say put meat on the bones, but it'll confirm, I think, some of the things that have been said here. And the first one I referred to is a foreign affairs survey, which was measuring up the public attitudes toward the elites and foreign policy issues. And the takeaways there were, and generally over 50-60% of the public sort of agreed with these. So I'll just pick out the 4 or 5 points, whatever it is that the way the public is viewing foreign affairs, international situations. First, of course, U.S. is still the most influential power in the world. So there's general consensus on that in the public and the U.S. Secondly, the public agrees that the most important goals in U.S. foreign policy should be the most important is prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. So we're in the throes of the Iranian decision. Thirdly, secure energy supplies. Some of this is being mitigated a bit by fracking and the new explosion in our GDP thanks to fracking. And some of that is just outside the Midwest in North Dakota, and then others to the east in Pennsylvania, and of course to the south in Texas. Combat international terrorism. And then it gets a little bit more decisive how to do that. There's not much enthusiasm in the general public for the use of force in Syria or Ukraine. So this was all said, and it's confirmed by this survey that was taken last June by the Foreign Affairs. Finally, on this was, I guess, the last topic of the day yesterday on the trade agreements, and I think was rightly pointed out in the question and answering that there is a partisan divide on all these issues in international affairs, defense, security, foreign policy, and but in general, the public is in favor of trade agreements, both in the Pacific and with the Europeans, generally. Obviously, I think someone was pointing, it might have been Craig yesterday, pointing out that, well, the Democrats may take a certain swing at this that wouldn't be the swing that the Republicans will take on it. But I think those are sort of the basics where the American public is, and it seems about right. And it probably, this is all things you know, but this is the sort of most recent survey data, and there are not that many surveys that have come along sort of taking this swing at it. By the way, there is a divide amongst the elites, between the elites and the public, as you might expect on some of these, with more acuity on the elite side with respect to perhaps intervention, combating terrorism and so forth. But the public generally, as you'd expect, and probably is the same in Europe, since 2008, as things have been surveyed, there's been a general weakening of interest in foreign activity and us being involved in foreign activity. And our foundation, Ken was generous enough to point out some of our early work in the mid-'80s with Memorial and Solidarity and Charter 77 and a number of authors, McNick, Brodsky, and people like that. But generally, even in our own foundation, which has stayed pretty much conservative through all these years in terms of our grant making, a pulling back from being sort of on the ground in Europe. Some of this was apart from the Iraq issue and the disagreement between our government and some in Europe. On the sort of intellectual side, the Kagan work, Paradise and Power, Venus and Mars, and then going back for us in the 80s when we were considering sort of where the political culture was in America and how we might influence it, a whole sort of replay of continental philosophy, Adorno, Habermas, Derrida, Foucault, and all the rest. So a sort of long train of sort of developing dissonance with respect to Europe. So all that this was laid out in terms of trust with Snowden and all the rest sort of tracks along with what we look at or have been looking at for the last 30 years in making grants that have to do with defense, security, international affairs. A study also in June to show you sort of some of the challenges ahead had to do with millennials and foreign policy and international affairs. It was entitled Millennials and U.S. Foreign Policy, the Next Generation's Attitude Towards Foreign Policy and War and Why They Matter. This was issued by the Cato Institute in June. And since the millennials, everybody likes saying millennials, plus they can all operate the technology and all the rest of it, but and put it together and take it apart, they represent, I think, at the moment in America, around 87 million adults. So that's about a quarter of the population and rising. As the baby boomers sort of advance through the years here, obviously the percentage will grow. Basically, the survey found that, I'll jump to the results, that millennials perceive the world as a significantly less threatening place than their elders do. They view foreign policies to deal with potential threats with much less urgency. That's one of the first findings. Secondly, millennials are more supportive of international cooperation than prior generations, hence our conversation last night with the ambassador about alliances and what you do to make them work better, leading, not leading, somewhere in between. Millennials, for example, are more likely to see China as a partner rather than a rival, and to believe that cooperation rather than confrontation with China is the appropriate strategy for the U.S. On the conservative side, elites, think tanks, people in government, local decision makers, state decision makers, I think you'd find generally are a little bit more concerned with the Chinese than maybe the millennials are referencing in this study. So it's a bit of a divide, which will only grow or could grow depending on the situations, obviously, that develop internationally. Finally, thanks to the particular impact of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the survey concluded or found that millennials are far less supportive of the use of military force, and whether this is the right conclusion that the survey drew out, that they may have internalized a sort of permanent case of Iraq aversion. So there's a little bit of a divide between the public in general and elites on foreign policy, on the conservative side in particular, but also on the millennials. There's even a larger divide on some of these issues. So I would just reference those two surveys for you. If you haven't seen them already, perhaps you have seen them, to give you sort of what the data says in the last month or two on where the public is with respect to foreign policy, international affairs, and interventions and alliances and trade agreements and so forth. While I think the talk generally seemed, I wouldn't say, well, I guess pessimistic. Trust is a sort of hard-earned kind of thing to win. I think there is some reason for optimism, and here we'll go to the Midwestern part. We have in our state, can reference Governor Walker, who announced his candidacy for the presidency on Monday. A young governor in his late 40s, obviously, as a governor of foreign policy, unless you're in New York or California or Texas, Florida, it's not a sort of primary focus. But he is Midwestern. He was born in Colorado Springs, but he raised in Iowa, Baptist father, then moved and spent really his formative years in education in Wisconsin. First sort of outside to the southwest of Madison, and then in Milwaukee. He served in the state assembly, which I mentioned earlier with Mark Green, but he also was county executive in Milwaukee and had really very good relations with all the communities in the city. And some of that had to do with faith and faith-based sort of approach to education reform and social welfare issues and so forth. He has maintained, and others actually maintain, that the electoral map, as it now sort of has been drawn up and finalized in the last few elections, shows the Midwest as, well, not being in the Republican camp, all the states, and I'm referring here to Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, that it really sort of holds the key for Republicans, and hence he comes along at a time that is probably not just for electoral politics, but also the kind of person that he is and what Midwestern values mean. And that, of course, ties back to sort of the Western tradition and the German heritage and all the other sort of East European immigration to the Middle West to populate our factories and farms. And with Walker being, I think, a pretty good spokesperson for those kind of values, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I'm not sure how many candidates we have. I think 16 candidates running for the presidency on the Republican side. But he's, other than John Kasich in Ohio, probably the only one that can make a pitch with a sort of, I think what he has and what's been lacking in our own politics, if you follow the Romney campaign, empathy. He has an empathy for people and their situation. So sort of the psychology of it and his style may fit. Other things may knock him out of the box. But I just wanted to close with some, because I think it's optimistic, and of course speeches on announcement of candidacies and speeches in front of campaigns and speeches in front of conventions sometimes have hyperbole. Sometimes they're not very specific. But I think knowing Walker a little bit and sort of who he is, it may give a preview of, at least sort of in the most general sense, of what kind of candidate he might be. First off, when he made his announcement, he said, well, he asserted boldly that the path for the Republican to win the presidency comes through the Midwest. And then he mentioned the states that I mentioned, that he firmly believes that that this will be the path for not just him, but for the good of the country. He gives his own personal testimony in these few words that he spoke last Monday on why he's seeking the nomination and how he thinks he'll win support, not just for the nomination, but eventually the people of the United States. He says, and I quote, "I realize, unlike some out there, I didn't inherit fame or fortune from my family. I got a bunch of things that were a whole lot better than that. I got from my grandparents the belief that if you work hard and play by the rules, here in America, you can do and be anything you want. Now, a lot of people have said that, but times make a difference. And especially given our own populism and concern about lack of trust in the government, taxes, size of government, international concerns, sometimes the words have a different resonating tone. He did have a brief section, an announcement on the U.S. and the world, which I'll close with. And the header for this section, maybe you can explain it to me, was true safety. It didn't talk about international affairs or defense of the homeland, but true safety. And the points he made were these, and some of them invoke another president at another time. So first off, he said, to prosper, we need a safe and stable world. Reasonable. He invoked President Reagan. We stand up for our friends and stand up to our enemies. We talked a lot about this, or you have talked a lot about the last day and a half. He would terminate the Iran deal if he were elected and impose tougher sanctions. Again, a general statement, but some steel in it. And he'd show, he's talking about steel, he would show Putin some steel with Ukraine. Didn't talk about intervening, but it shows some steel. And then the Chinese, as a sort of last point that he raised on international affairs, that he would go after these cyber attacks and get bipartisan support for ending the Chinese incursion in our data systems, and then also do something to prevent their incursions in international waters. So those were his foreign policy, international defense references during his speech. So I just cite for you these two surveys and sort of things we look at. We don't put our finger up in the wind typically when we're making grants, but to try to follow sort of where the political culture is, where society is going. And then because of where we started and a strong belief in Western civilization and its contributions, some of which have been sort of ignored or cast aside or at least put in the closet, try to look for people like yourselves abroad and then people at home that will persuade the public in conversation, debate, and in policy making that transmission belt that those early Germans in Milwaukee and other places around the country, that Poles and Slovaks, Ukrainians bequeathed to generations behind them, that somehow we can renew and revivify and oil up those transmission belts with good leadership. So that's the nature of my remarks.
Take a couple questions. Yeah, thank you, Dan. That was terrific and very informative, and I think a lot of us can identify with what you've laid out, and particularly the sort of when you talked about the history of the Germans in Milwaukee and the famous visit by Konrad Adenauer, and how today that's sort of those of us. I mean, I look at my own family. I look at what the languages my children are learning, and they're Chinese. They're not doing European languages. I did French and German. Similarly, and I think this is something that I see this in a lot of individuals. Where just Europe is no longer a model here in the United States intellectually in any way, shape, or form. And sadly to say, and it's actually the fault of European intellectuals who convinced us of this and who were so successful, as you mentioned, Derrida and others. But it creates a deeper crisis in the alliance. We have time for a couple of quick questions. So yeah, Roberta.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
The microphone, great. It was brief enough, I hope. Everyone was digesting their barbecue.
I'm Werner Fassland from Austria. Thank you very much for your presentation. Most of us came already a little bit pre-informed about the person you presented, and I think, he is very attractive. Now being here, of course, watching TV, everybody is surprised about the rising star within the Republican nomination team. So maybe you can tell us a little your personal judgment about this phenomenon.
Well, at first I should start with a disclaimer, which I should have started with. As a foundation, and we're tax exempt by U.S., we don't engage in politics, even though we know this particular candidate. Actually, we know a number of them. And in, let's say, Jeb Bush's case, he had, and now he's taken himself out of a very impressive and important foundation for education reform. And digital education has been a big sort of thing for him, and he was very involved in school reform in Florida as governor. So a number of these people we've helped, not so much again in their political career, although that might be a byproduct, but in other ways when they were doing public policy outside the sort of arena of politics. What accounts for it? Well, of course, you have not a synonym in Europe. I mean, you have the conversation today especially spoke of right-wing and then all the influences and so forth reacting to immigration, obviously as a key issue, but also employment issues and so forth. So in the States, 2008 changed a lot of things. People in terms of the houses they could not afford to pay any longer, the inability to get loans, I would say a distrust of those who had the reins of authority, especially in financial services. There's certainly social tumult. The Supreme Court in the United States just rendered several decisions, one on health care, and secondly on marriage, especially on the conservative side, not so much on the liberal. This is it's an interesting moment. And again, I think all of you know these things because there are some parallels in Europe in this. This has contributed. So there's social difficulties, economic. Obviously, there's been some difficulties in some urban areas. Our own city, for example, in the last 2 weeks, we've gone through, I think, 14 homicides. Milwaukee's a city of about 600,000 people. The metro area is about 1.5 million. So it's not in the top 20 cities. It's probably around 39th largest. And we're not known to have a sort of difficulty with this issue, but a lot of it just random shootings. So we didn't have a Baltimore or Ferguson situation, although there have been several incidences involving the police with people who were arrested and then somehow fate befell them, which wasn't good. In a couple of cases, a couple of deaths. So, but these random shootings are taking place, and people. So there's just anxiety. People are leading their lives very normally and so forth, but this debate that the French began and has sort of been picked up somewhat in the Vatican about inequality and capitalism, while it filters down in a way, as all of you know, it doesn't start out at the Habermas, Foucault. I mean, it starts there, I should say, but it finds its way into more popular sort of understandings. I think that's contributing to it. So just I think as it is generally in the West, there's some concern about a variety of things, and a lot of it's economic. As you know, foreign policy typically, at least in American elections, it never rises to the top of issues. It's typically economics and society that people will list those kinds of situations as the reasons they go to the poll and vote the way they do. So we have a populist upsurge. Not the first time in our history. We can go back in the 19th century on farmlands and then through the labor movement in the 20th century. But this one has all the possibility of communication one to the other and all the devices, which can help encourage discussion or worse than that, a little bit of turmoil. So Walker doesn't, I think, and others too, he's not the only one, doesn't play to this, at least not so far. We'll see how the campaign goes and what kind of pressure a fellow like Donald Trump puts on people if he stays in the race on immigration is the issue. But there are other issues that could easily fit that sort of thing. But I wasn't trying to be, I think, too utopian or Pollyannish in speaking of him that way. He has a record of which has been, sort of dragged through a bit by the unions because he took the unions on, the public unions in Wisconsin, and therefore the national union movement really went after him and talk about him in very disparaging terms, comparing him to Hitler and things. I mean, but I think at the moment, and I don't think he will because of his background, because of where he served, Wisconsin, that I think it will be more Reagan-esque than not, although I think the invocations of Reagan may not be as plentiful when he was first contemplating running, just because this millennials issue. Reagan is not a figure for young people, especially those who are leaning conservative in the United States, because of the memory issue. I mean, if they remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, that would be good, because a lot of the history classes that are being, especially at the sort of elementary school and high school level, your gymnasiums have not been as attentive to disciplined teaching of history.
We'll take Roland, and then we'll go to
thanks.
Let me ask everybody to keep the questions brief and also
Really
the answer
brief.
Okay, we need to wrap up by 2. So
Thanks, Ken. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Martens Centre in Brussels. Well, I'm German. I've been to Milwaukee. Indeed, I feel even more at home in that place than in the rest of the United States. But sticking to remaining with the question of inequality, I think it's really interesting. I mean, in Europe, it's been a topic basically all along. In America, it used to be something for the left wing of the Democratic Party, maybe, but now it seems to have gone far beyond the Democrats, and some of the Republican candidates for nomination are already picking it up. What is Scott Walker's recipe if he doesn't want to fall into the sort of left of center, statist solution thinking? What can a center right candidate in America do about inequality?
Should I take another? Okay, I don't think he's been specific other than watch what he did as county exec, and it was mostly trim the government, keep taxes low, look for growth and opportunity in terms of attracting businesses. So I don't know that there's any sort of, if I say not sophisticated, that's too pejorative, but I don't think he's addressed it in a way that would reveal a sort of intellectual understanding, other than I think what I read you about sort of in America, he can do anything. And I think he has related that, especially to what he did as county executive, where he tried to trim the sort of confusing labyrinth of regulations and that involving the city and county government. So I think it's a sort of stay tuned. The interesting thing will be when the Pope comes and he addresses Congress, unusual, I think, the first time. And apart from this issue, the economy, which he's been very articulate on, it has caused problems in the conservative community, American conservative community. His descriptions of capitalism and sort of the very colorful words he's used on occasion. And then, of course, the climate change issue. By the way, Walker hasn't spoken too much on the climate, but I think that'll become an issue.
Thank you. Miriam Lexman, International Republican Institute. I have a question, hope you can answer. And it's I come from Slovakia, and the entrepreneurship and freedom values were first embraced, and then people started to be scared of it because they realized that it's values which you have to fight for every day, and it's actually not so easy. So I just wonder, from the experience of your foundation, was there a project which you said, like, oh, this, like when you were enthusiastic and you saw that this was a good approach, this was a great idea how to sustain these values in post-communist or post-totalitarian countries? Thank you.
Yeah, quickly, in the early 90s, we supported, for example, Charles University in Prague. People went over, and this was at the sort of graduate school level. So that was a sort of combination of various things, business practices, but it also had to do with entrepreneurial activity and growing businesses. Obviously, laws have to change, tax laws and all kinds of other regulation issues, which I think are still being worked out in Europe. So some of the things that we would fund here, you couldn't apply there. But a lot of the work we did in the civil society realm, one was, of course, with religious freedom. And our issue was orthodoxy in the East and Western Christianity and the gap there. That was an interest to us. But that involved leadership with young people. And so for the Catholics, the social doctrine of the church was important. So all that comes out of it. So there were entrepreneurship programs we supported, but basically we sort of focused on, in the early years, 90, after Berlin Wall fell, the training of young people to do things that would allow them to move up, like some, I think, in this room have, through ministries and through government service and public administration. So we helped there. And then programs with people coming to lecture, trying to help small groups start up, like Slovakia and Ukraine. And so nothing magical, all pretty incremental.
We'll have time for one last question. Oh, actually, let's go in the back, actually, since you folks got to ask, and it's okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ken. Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Brussels. Stefan Gil's my name. Thank you for repeatedly mentioning Konrad Adenauer. And but my question is, if Mr. Walker becomes president, when he becomes president, what about the Affordable Care Act? Is it reversible technically? Is it desirable to get reversed at all? And will he reverse it? How did he express himself on this question? Thank you.
Well, he was one of the governors who didn't expand Medicaid. And so he didn't take and he didn't set up a federal exchange. So he was on the hook. And he said out of principle he wouldn't do it because it needed to be reversed. Now, on that point, he hasn't talked about reversal, but I think on the conservative side of the aisle, there is, I don't want to call it confusion, but they're uncertain. And so I think it's hard to answer that question, especially with the president there. And then now with this recent court decision, it'll be interesting. But I think there's nothing wrong with working it out. But Walker stood on principle, and many governors took the expansion, and which was as big a risk really as the other. But as it turned out, Walker was right. So I think, again, his instinct, which why I picked those couple of quick quotes out of there, I think his instincts are good. Obviously, in practice, as all of you know better than I, dealing with policy and European unions and Congress of the United States, sometimes you can't always sort of pursue it in the way that you think is best, but you can come up with a compromise.
Yeah. Let me just add, there are a number of proposals out there, some of which some of the candidates are looking at, which would turn the program much more towards tax credits for health care, and which would somehow alleviate the federal role. We can take the last question quickly if. Thank
you. My name is Barbara Dello. I'm also interested in millennials, and it's interesting because I was a school nurse and I went back, got a degree in political science just because of what I saw as a high school nurse. And you mentioned the lack of concern about foreign policy threats, particularly at a time when there are so many. What do you attribute a lot of these changes with the young people? Because I know I would sit around a table and I'd be the only one in the room thinking one way, and all the people who are 18 thought differently. And I wondered if you think a lot of this was a result of the education received in the public school systems, and also on millennials on the issue of liberty. I'm very interested in how the liberty language and the libertarian movement language mirrors the language of the pro-euthanasia movement. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that.
Unfortunately, I don't have the competence to speak to, because Bradley wasn't involved in the survey. We didn't draw up the questions and all, but clearly ed reform, it's been a big issue for us and others in the United States, as I think it has been in Europe in many ways, for different reasons on both continents. But obviously it has a big impact on what people know when they come out of school, what they do with what they know, and then how they act as human beings is a combination, obviously, of their family, another point for discussion, their family and their life experiences and what they apply from the family, or what they should have applied had they learned it in the family. So there's a relationship, I think, between some of the trends you see in millennials. Not all bad, not all good, but just interesting for policymakers.
Okay, well, look, thank you, Dan. We're very fortunate to have heard your remarks. I don't think there's anybody in the foundation community who both has had as deep an impact on the public policy debate while remaining as deeply in touch with what is really going on in the country outside of Washington. We here in Washington tend to live in an elite bubble where we hear the same opinions, the same arguments, don't deal with real people who have real jobs. And we have a tendency to only deal with lawyers, policy people. And so it's especially enlightening to have someone come from outside Washington, especially someone who is obviously so close to one of the major presidential candidates. So I want to thank you for your remarks. We will now move over to Hudson Institute. Hudson is at 1015 15th Street, 15th and K, and we just have to cut across the park, and it's about an 8-minute walk maximum. 1015 15th Street, the 6th floor. Look forward to seeing you there at 2:30.
And
Thank you.
You won't have to use Google Maps to find Hudson. We have people who will be waiting outside here who can guide you over, Martin's staff and IRI staff. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure hosting you here at the International Republican Institute. We hope that you found the sessions this morning interesting, and we look forward to some very interesting sessions at the Hudson Institute. So thanks to Dan Schmidt and Ken Weinstein. Thank you.